Well, hi. It's a great pleasure to be with you, actually. When Mark invited me to speak to the Bathurst Diocese, I was reminded that when I used to sing in a band called In the Silence, we toured all around, all of country Australia. But I especially remember our Bathurst tour. And Mark sent me a list of all the towns in his diocese, about 15 or 20 towns. And I reckon I've been to half of them doing shows. So the thought that I'm now preaching is just a real delight to me. I want to talk about being open about our faith during these really difficult times. I was years ago in a cafe with a pastor friend talking about what we were doing at my church to reach out to the people of our suburb. And I noticed this woman sitting a few tables away in the cafe, looking sort of inquisitive at me. Well, that's how I interpreted it. So I kept on talking to my friend about what we were doing to reach out to others with the news of Jesus Christ. And then eventually this woman came over. She paid her bill and walked over to our table. And at what seemed like the top of her voice, in front of a packed cafe, she said, "You want to convert the world, do you? How dare you?" And off she stormed. I was dumbfounded. I mean, obviously this was the moment I realized she might not have been a Christian after all, but I didn't know what to say. I was just struck dumb. And, it was a really powerful reminder to me that even though I was meant to be a professional God botherer, I didn't know what to say in that context. The cynicism she had toward Christianity just left me silent. And I'll tell you that because I just want to make clear that this subject of speaking up about our faith is not an easy one, even for the professionals. I reckon if you've known Christ for more than about 5 minutes, you will have experienced a kind of shyness, every now and then, a shyness about piping up. And perhaps especially now, during this lockdown, because we could get some really awkward questions at the moment about the Christian faith. You might find that people are asking, what's God doing? Where is he in the midst of this? Is this pandemic the judgment of God? And so on. And so I want to draw some encouragement from 1 Peter chapter 3, where the Apostle Peter encourages Christians who are under pressure to be open about their Christian faith. If this were a different kind of talk, I'd love to tell you a little bit of the history that we know of the region to which Peter wrote. We call it Turkey now, but it was Pontus and Bithynia and Asia. And we know that within a generation of this letter of Peter, the Christians there suffered immense persecution. Peter simply refers to a fiery ordeal later in chapter 4. But if we had time, I'd read to you from a letter from the Roman governor Pliny to the Emperor Trajan. He was the governor of this very region, and he speaks about killing Christians. He says that I ask them in person if they are Christians. If they admit it, I repeat it with a warning a second or third time. If they persist, I order them to be led away for execution. And it goes on and on. I won't bother with that. But 1 Peter was written in the prelude to an awful persecution. And the Christians there wanted to be quiet, I bet. I bet the emotional pressure was to be shy about the Christian faith. And instead, the apostle urges them to speak up. And so that's what this wonderful passage in 1 Peter chapter 3, from verses 13 to 16, is all about. And he provides a number of lessons that I think are worth our attention just for a few minutes today. The first thing Peter urges is to revere Christ. Before he gets to say anything about speaking up for the faith, always giving an answer, what he actually says there in verse, let's go from verse 14. But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not be frightened. Do not fear their threats, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord, always being prepared to give an answer. The first thing he says is revere Christ as Lord in our hearts. The logic, I think, is that there were many things to fear in the world of those first Christians, but they need to remember to revere Christ above all things. Actually, the original language of this sentence is quite powerful because it says, revere Christ as Lord, always being prepared to give an answer. They're not two separate questions. They're linked. Our reverence for Christ, our worship of Christ, is directly connected with our willingness to speak up for him. You know, there are all sorts of reasons Christians can be shy about the Christian faith. Maybe there are intellectual questions where we're worried about, we don't know the answers to. Perhaps we're just shy human beings. Perhaps we ourselves have doubts and really don't want to be exposed. Whatever the reasons for Christian coyness, the antidote is right here in this text. Revere Christ as Lord in our hearts. Don't think in terms of, oh, I have to evangelize my neighbors. First think of who Christ is. Know that he is to be revered above all things. And then watch your speaking about Christ just bubble up as a natural consequence. So firstly, revere Christ. And it's out of this reverence for Christ that Peter issues the encouragement to reply, to give a reply. He says, always be prepared. So verse 15, in your hearts revere Christ as Lord, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. Notice Peter doesn't tell us all to preach. We're not told we're all evangelists. No, Peter simply says, be prepared to give an answer. And that's something we can all do. And he's quite adamant about it. He says, always be prepared to give an answer, and to everyone. So, although we're not all told to be preachers, we are answerers. We are to give an answer for our faith. And I suppose at the moment, there are some tricky questions people might want to ask us in the context of this pandemic. And they may want to say, what's God doing? Why does he allow it? Is this judgment? Where is God in the midst of all the suffering we see around the world? Just a few things that I think might be worth talking about. I think the easiest way to reply to anyone who asks you about this is really just to say, look, frankly, I don't know what God's doing, but I do know he wants me and the church to care for people who are vulnerable. And so I can do that, and that's where I'm going to be focusing my attention. Now, that may seem like a cop-out, but actually I think most people who ask you about all this will be satisfied to go, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. But if you do get an opportunity to go a little bit deeper, I think there are a few things that you might want to mention. One is that this isn't the judgment of God. People have been talking like it's the judgment of God. I won't name names, but some Christian leaders have come out and said, oh, it's the judgment of God for particular sins. But actually, Jesus spoke to this question in Luke 13, where he is quizzed by people who thought a natural disaster that occurred, a tower falling on people, occurred because they were worse sinners. And Jesus absolutely rules that out. He says, no, that is not what is happening here. He doesn't then explain what it was, but he rules out that it is judgment. Yes, the text goes on to say to those people, hey, but beware that you don't fall into the actual judgment of God. But he's not connecting that final judgment with the event of the natural disaster. So I think we can rule that out. The closest thing the Bible gives to an explanation of these kinds of natural sufferings is that creation has gone astray as a kind of reverberation of humanity going astray from the Creator. So something has fallen, not just in our own hearts, but in the very creation itself. That's about as close to an explanation as the Bible gives. And I think the last thing maybe that's worth saying, probably the most important thing to say to people who ask us about this, is to do with where God is in the midst of a pandemic. Where is he in all the suffering? And I think the most important thing to say is that the God Christians believe in is the God who gave himself on a cross for us. He has entered into human suffering. He is not aloof, he is not distant, but he is present. He's not the God who just wound up the clock and left us to suffer. He entered into our suffering. So whatever is the ultimate explanation for the suffering of this world, we know it must be consistent with a God who would himself share our pain, himself enter into our world and identify with our suffering. Well, you may or may not be comfortable saying any of those particular things, but there is one aspect of speaking up Peter urges us all to do: respect those we talk with. He makes this quite clear when he says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience so that those who speak maliciously against your good behaviour in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. Peter asks us to respect the human beings who have asked us questions and to be gentle toward them. These are two really important words. I mean, it's true that not every criticism of the Christian faith deserves respect, but the people criticizing the faith or asking us about the faith are made in the image of God and so are worthy of respect. And sometimes it's hard to be gentle when people critique Christianity, but the love of Christ should compel us to a humility, to a gentleness that refuses to be smug or self-righteous or to bully anyone, but simply to offer our answer with respect and gentleness. We might not know what to say in every situation, but we all know how to say it with gentleness and respect. And you know, you never can really predict what a simple answer to someone's question may bring about. My own Christian story, as a 16-year-old, having never been inside a church, I asked a teacher at my school a question. This teacher was openly Christian, and I asked her, what does God think of me? And I was a little bit of a skeptical teenager, but I was curious to know what this person thought. And this woman just said to me these few words, John, God sees everything you've done, said, and thought. And then she left a pause, and I remember feeling pretty awkward, thinking, oh no, God sees everything I've done, said, and thought. And then she followed it up with, but he loves you even still. I thanked her for the comment. I shot out into the playground, but I couldn't get rid of those words. They went round and round in my head. God knows everything I've done, said, and thought, but he loves me even still. And I would say, humanly speaking, this was the thing that first prompted me to want to know this God who knew me and, despite me, loved me. You never know how a simple answer to someone's question might promote Christ in a beautiful way. Peter, in this passage, asks us to revere Christ. Before we think about mission, let's think about worship. Let's know who he is, revere him, and we won't fear anything else. Peter asks us then, out of that reverence for Christ, to give a reply to everyone who asks us, to just be willing to step up and say something for Jesus. But then he reminds us to do it with respect and gentleness, because that's what the gospel calls from us, because we believe in a God who entered into the world, gave himself for us in such humility, and rose again to give life. And so our speech to others must be of that kind, humble, life-giving. God bless you.